Now, in a final matter, Madam President, anyone who's been attentive to the news these past few days has learned about the complete debacle that unfolded in last November's election for North Carolina's 9th Congressional District. Soon after Election Day, allegations of illegal ballot harvesting and vote tampering clouded a close result. The wrongdoing seemed to have benefited the Republican candidate over the Democrat. Just last week, we saw the State Board of Elections unanimously call for a new election. Now, Madam President, for years and years, every Republican who dared to call for common sense safeguards for Americans' ballots was demonized by Democrats and their allies. We were hit with left-wing talking points insisting that voter fraud wasn't real. Never happens, they said. Well, that fraud just didn't happen. That modest efforts to ensure that voters who are who they say they are and are voting in the proper place were really some sinister right-wing plot to prevent people from voting. So now, as you might expect, now that an incident of very real voter fraud has become national news and the Republican candidate seems to have benefited, these longstanding Democratic talking points have been really quiet. Haven't heard much lately from Democrats about how fraud never happens. They've gone silent. Now some are singing a different tune. Now there's a new interest in ensuring the sanctity of American elections. I've been focused for decades on protecting the integrity of elections. So I'd like to welcome my friends on the left to their new realization. They've just discovered that this subject really matters. But I've yet to see any evidence, Madam President, they're actually interested in cleaning up the conditions that leads to messes like this one in North Carolina. At the root of the North Carolina debacle is a practice that's known as ballot harvesting. Essentially, it's a means by which campaign representatives can collect absentee ballots on the premise of delivering them to a polling place or election office. That's what ballot harvesting is. So think about it. Who in American politics keeps long lists of potential voters? Who mobilizes networks of people to go door to door? Who funds and stands up these kinds of canvassing organizations? Who does those things? Madam President, I'm sorry to say they are not huge teams of politically neutral Eagle Scouts roving the country, hoping to use ballot harvesting to politely make voters' lives more convenient. This is not an Eagle Scout activity. No, the folks who really lick their lips at the prospect of mass ballot harvesting are political operatives, of course. Political operatives, interest groups, and one-sided political machines. This is why many jurisdictions, including North Carolina, have outlawed the practice altogether. Say that again. Many jurisdictions, including North Carolina, have outlawed this practice altogether. Ballot harvesting threatens to change the nature of our representative democracy. Forget about persuading people and spurring them to turn out to the polls. This practice makes elections a kind of scavenger hunt to see which side's operatives can return to headquarters with the most ballots in the trunks of their cars. And once those operatives take a hold of these ballots, the voters have no way to keep tabs on whether they were ever delivered. Now, of course, a system that invites political operatives to be rewarded for turning up ballots will open the door to misbehavior. Remember, it's illegal in North Carolina and most states for the obvious reason. But I've noted with interest the Democrats' new focus on this practice is yet to extend to California. I wonder why. Well, in California, Madam President, it's legal. It's a common practice in California. California allows anyone, not just family members, anyone, to show up at a polling place on election day with ballots that are not theirs. Welcome to California. Reports suggest that Orange County alone saw, listen to this, 250,000 absentee ballots dropped off on election day last year. 250,000 absentee ballots dropped off on election day. The county's registrar told a newspaper that some individuals dropped off hundreds of other people's ballots. And we have no way to know if those ballots were sealed or even voted when they were harvested. The only evidence we have that the voter cast his or her ballot is the signature. Now, this past election cycle turned out favorably for California Democrats, amazingly enough. These late arriving ballots seemed to help turn several races their way. Maybe this helps explain why. When House GOP leaders expressed concern over ballot harvesting in California, the state's Democrat Secretary of State mocked their concern by saying, what they call strange and bizarre, we call democracy. And now ballot harvesting has thrown out an election result in the U.S. House of Representatives. Legal in California, illegal in North Carolina. So maybe that helps explain why, as it stands, the Democrat Politician Protection Act, Speaker Pelosi's massive new federal takeover of the way states and communities run their elections, contains no effort whatsoever to crack down on ballot harvesting. Not in there. Instead, it contains provision after provision that would erode the protections that are supposed to ensure votes reflect the voice of the voter whose name is on the envelope. It contains provision after provision that would erode the protections that are supposed to ensure votes reflect the voice of the voter whose name is on the envelope. Provision after provision would erode common sense protections and bring the guardrails down. So would a serious reform
And the
bill
Senate
aim
about to
take
gavel
away
back
states'
in. They're
ability
expected to vote on the